Hello again. I'm Braddock Supervisor John Cook. Welcome back to Braddock Neighborhood News, the program I am using to provide you with information on issues facing our community and ideas on how we can strengthen our neighborhoods. Today's show focuses on Diversion First, a major new initiative in Fairfax County that is one of the most important efforts we have undertaken in recent years. This program has the potential to help hundreds of people get needed mental health treatment. In the long run, we will reduce incarceration rates and save significant tax dollars. Joining me today are Gary Ambrose, Chairman of the Diversion First Stakeholders Group, Laura Yeager from the Community Services Board, and Lieutenant Ryan Morgan with the Fairfax County Police Department. Thank you all for joining me on the show today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Let's, Diversion First. Laura, I'm going to start with you. Tell us what that means. What's the program about?
Well, it's really a huge initiative that a variety of us in the community have undertaken to really look at helping. The overall mission is to help keep people, get people treatment for mental health issues, as opposed to involving them in the judicial system, incarcerating them, having them face charges that really aren't going to benefit them in the long run in getting mental health help.
It's an outgrowth of the Stepping Up Initiative, which is a national initiative that Fairfax County signed on to last June, whose goal is to reduce the number of people with mental illness in our jails and prisons by diverting them to treatment as opposed to incarcerating them.
Right. And you know, this has been a concept that's floated around for a while nationally as well as in Fairfax, finally getting some traction with it, but we know that for somebody with mental illness, jail is probably the worst place to be.
Absolutely.
And the need for treatment is so important. And even the purposes of a criminal justice system, which is to prevent crime from reoccurring, you don't serve those purposes if the underlying reason that a crime occurred was mental illness. Unless you're treating the illness, you're actually having that chance of recidivism happen more. So we're meeting our crime goals by diverting into treatment.
Right.
And Gary, let me ask you, when Chairman Bulova sponsored the Diversion First Initiative, asked me to co-sponsor that resolution with the board passed it, and then the call came to you, would you head up the stakeholders group? And there were about 40 people in that group, and you're in charge of it, and just talk about that experience, because we put a whole lot on your shoulders. You're doing great with it, but it's a big job. And tell us about that experience.
Well, that first stakeholders meeting was like a who's who of Fairfax County. We had Delegate Vivian Watts, we had 4 judges, we had Chairman Bulova and yourself. We had a room full of police and fire chiefs. There were representatives from local hospitals, of course, from human services, and from advocacy groups, and even some private citizens who wanted to be on it. And I've seen it take off since we had that first meeting all the way back in August, and I think it's because it's the right thing to do and people are on board.
And just general snapshot of what we're talking about is there's normally going to be a call to police, it might be to fire, someone who might otherwise have been arrested, brought to the jail. Instead, police officer is going to make that call that this person should go to the Community Service Board for maybe some treatment. Lieutenant Morgan, let's talk about that. A big part of this right off the bat is training that police officer to recognize a mental health issue, and that's what you're responsible for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so happy that we've already have 4 classes under our belt, and we're learning how to do it better. We're following the national model, the Memphis model, and it was adopted by Virginia. And so far we have about 90 officers trained. And we know we have a lot more to go. It just helps these officers with an option. They don't always have to take someone to jail. And quite frankly, I think a lot of officers know that that's not the right place for some people. This Diversion First initiative has really given us options, and that's what we really enjoy. Being able to take somebody who could otherwise go to jail but provide them treatment instead of incarceration.
And Lieutenant Morgan, you're heading up our police department's effort for CIT, Crisis Intervention Team Training, actually even broader than Diversion First, but because we recognize that of all the situations that our police officers respond to, we're so fortunate in Fairfax County that very few of those are shootings, very few are gang-related, very few are violent crimes, but a lot of them are people, mental health challenge, people with disabilities, hard to communicate, emotional circumstances that people have gotten themselves involved with, a fight with a neighbor in the household. And what this training is about is really how to have our police officers know how to handle those situations. We're asking police officers to be psychologists and social workers as well as police officers. That's a challenge.
Yeah, and we do wear many hats. When you call the police or when you call 911 in the middle of the night, the dispatchers have to figure out whether it's a medical emergency or something else. Police department usually gets something else, everything else. And it's not a bad thing, and we do wear many hats. And there are many times where you need the law enforcement side of a police officer. If your home's getting broken into or if someone's attacking you, you want to call 911. You want to have that law enforcement part of a police officer. But there are times where it's a crisis situation, and you need that situation stabilized. You don't need that law enforcement component. And this training really helps those officers really deal with those crisis type situations.
And we want regular residents of the county to understand if there's an emergency, they call 911. Right. They don't have to figure out who's the right one to call. We the county, will figure that out, and our officers will be trained. And then if it is a circumstance where the people involved or somebody involved needs some mental health treatment, that's where we go to the Community Services Board. And Laura, that's where the staff there and all of your colleagues are really getting, ramping up to do what we have needed done, what we've been doing, but now we can do really in the scope that needs to be done, which is provide that treatment.
Absolutely, and I would say that we couldn't do any of this without kind of these vital partnerships with mental health, with the police department, with the sheriff's office, and the judicial system and community groups. It's been amazing how all of us have come together in total agreement about this really needs to happen and move forward. For folks who get involved with Ryan and his colleagues, there's now an opportunity for them to come to the Merrifield Crisis Response Center, where whether they're brought in under custody or voluntarily, help is available there 24/7 in our emergency services offices. People can receive assessments if people are having medication issues. Any resident of Fairfax County and the cities of Fairfax and Falls Church can go there in a crisis situation 24/7 and get help. Also from there, we have walk-in assessment services. If people think that they need treatment and assistance, they can walk in during business hours, get an assessment, and get referred for additional services. So.
And just to sort of illustrate that for folks, let's just make up a scenario. Let's say you've got somebody in the convenience store late at night and they're knocking over things and causing a ruckus and threatening to punch people, and so store owner calls 911, police officer shows up, and what's that officer going to do, Lieutenant Morgan, to assess the situation?
Yeah, wow. It could go different ways. I think police officers are generally pretty good about reading people. It's just what we do every day. Interacting with people is just sort of one of our primary duties. So the officer does have to figure out what's going on. Many times the shopkeeper, in this case the convenience store clerk, he just wants the person out. That's all he cares about is restoring order to his business. He's not interested in pressing charges. He just realized something's wrong. Officers are going to get there. They're going to find out who the individual is, what's going on. Sometimes there's past history that helps an officer gain a bit more understanding about who they're dealing with. Other times it's a brand new person that we've never had contact with before. But officers can generally gauge what's going on, with the person. Maybe the person's in crisis or does have some either a co-occurring substance abuse issue or has some sort of mental illness. And that officer now has the option, other than jail, to get that person over to the Merrifield Center, the emergency services section, where the professionals can really delve into it.
Right, and that's the diversion part. That's where that word comes from. So obviously if that officer determines, hey, this person is just, out to make trouble, they're going to arrest them as is appropriate. But if the officer determines, hey, this person's having a mental health crisis, instead of going to the jail, we take them to Merrifield, to the CSB, and Laura, pick up the story there. What happens?
Well, we work there, police officers and sheriff deputies on duty. How many hours?
We're like 23 out of 24 hours. There's somebody
there's
there.
coverage by law enforcement personnel, so they can. An officer can drop someone off and then go back out on the street because they've transferred the custody of a person if they're in custody. We do an assessment on every person who comes into emergency services to really determine the level of crisis. We determine, does this person need hospitalization? Do we need to work on finding a bed for them? Or do we need to refer them for some additional services, whether our own or community-based services? But that happens, I want to say immediately, but it happens. The person doesn't leave there without getting an assessment. And we also assess for risk of suicide or harm to other people by trained clinicians. They're very compassionate about what they do and very respectful. And I'd also just add a comment about crime. We have a lot of stereotypes, I think, about people with mental illness and about, you see a lot of stuff in the news about violent acts and all of this. The reality is people with mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators, even though we know that sometimes people may be experiencing an episode where they may, lash out at someone or whatever. That's not the norm. So.
And what's so important about this, and Gary, I'll ask you to speak to this because there's been a lot of studying about this and national models that have said that if that person we've been talking about who needed that treatment, if they're taken directly to jail, then they're going to cycle through the criminal justice system, usually more than once, multiple times. Mm-hmm. They're not getting treatment. They're not getting better. They're going to the convenience store someplace else at a later date. The same thing happening, revolving door. But Gary, what we know is with diversion, we actually help people break that revolving door.
Absolutely. In the United States today, there are 10 times as many people with mental illness in our jails and prisons as there are in the remaining state mental hospitals. And so basically our jails and prisons have become our mental hospitals. If you took a look at Fairfax County, the sheriff estimates that up to maybe as high as half of our inmates in the adult detention center suffer or either live with mental illness or a substance use disorder or both. And so the imperative is there for us to come up with a better solution. People with mental illness need to be in treatment and not in jail, and that's what Diversion First does.
Right, and because what's happened in the past is if that person's in jail, they'll go through, if it's at the convenience store, what charge would they be charged with? It's going to be a relatively minor charge.
Correct, yeah.
And maybe they get probably a time-served sentence because by the time their trial date comes, they've been in jail longer than the sentence for that crime, and they haven't gotten treatment, and so they get out of jail, and what happens? Another incident happens.
They go back to the convenience store. It's a revolving door, and there were some numbers that were floated around. The substantial cost of incarcerating a person for a year. I mean, it's not pennies. I mean, it's real dollars, and the cost for incarcerating a person over a year.
It's about $67,000
right.
locally.
That's compared
for
to
incarceration, and the cost of treatment is about 10% of that, I think.
I think you're right, yeah.
And a CSB-related program. So for those who are thinking tax dollars, there's a long-term benefit for that. For those of us thinking in terms of the human element too, we're going to break that cycle. We're not going to have that person keep coming back into jail. We'll get them into treatment where they can get help. And we know, Gary, from nationwide research and where it's been happening, that I think the recidivism rate, that repetition rate drops from 80% to about 20%.
Absolutely, and we've benchmarked some large municipalities that have been doing this now for years. And one is Bexar County in Texas, where San Antonio is located. And they estimate that they save about $10 million a year by virtue of their jail diversion program. A few years back, they have a jail that houses a little over 3,000 people. A few years back, they were looking for funds to build a new jail because they were so overcrowded. At the same time, they were rolling out their jail diversion program. And today, they're still operating out of the same old jail, but they have 1,000 vacant beds, and that's 1,000 people who might not have received treatment had they just been taken to jail.
Right. And now, for those who are saying, oh, great, so it's easy, we just divert over. The challenge, and it falls to Laura's colleagues, is that, and Gary, you referenced the institutionalization. You know, we, in the 1960s, we went through a phase in this country of saying we're going to get people with mental illness out of institutions. The idea was get community-based services. Right. Didn't really happen. We have effectively re-institutionalized people in our jails. Yes. That doesn't work. So when we do diversion first, we need to divert to something. Laura, what we need to have that system of community-based care.
And Fairfax County, I would say we are extremely lucky with the local government support we have, federal funding, state funding, but the bulk of the commitment really comes from our local government, so thank you. But we have a very robust system of care for folks with mental illness, substance use disorders, intellectual disability. From emergency services, which is that immediate care, we have a fantastic detoxification facility, outpatient services, we have residential treatment, residential helping people reintegrate into the community, employment services, because if we want this to be successful, people need to have jobs, they need to have homes. And often the folks we're working with are at the greatest risk. We also have aftercare. So one of the features of diversion is really a lot of people who are coming out of jail or who are coming out of emergency services or a crisis care situation really need supports that are stronger than just I go to my therapist once a week. Right. They really need wraparound services, and we have teams of staff who actually provide those services, a psychiatrist who makes home visits for these intense needed, the high intense needs, and it's really an amazing system. We don't have enough to really reach the folks that we want to reach and the anticipated increases in numbers through diversion, but we know some best practices, and we have some really, really skilled staff here in Fairfax to address that.
And let's go back to our example again and talk about sort of a day in the life. So that person we have diverted, right, the convenience store person we've diverted into the program, instead of sitting in the jail cell all day, what is that person's day going to look like in the community-based program that you're going to provide?
Well, it really depends on what their assessment, what level of care they need. Some people need residential treatment. Some people need outpatient treatment. Some people need intense day treatment. So it depends on their diagnosis and really what level of care that they need. But our goal is to really wrap supports around them, individualized, because we can't cookie cutter mental health treatment. It has to really be based on individual needs, how much family support exists for a person. But a day could be, I go to my doctor, I go to my, I see a psychiatrist. This isn't in any one day, but over time, I go to a support group in the community, I go to a treatment group. If you're in a residential setting, you would be there 24/7. So it, again, depends on the level of care, but we are lucky that we have a variety of supports available to people.
And Gary, while we've talked about diverting at the moment of what would have been an arrest, as the system sort of gets its legs and gets going, there are diversion points throughout the system. You mentioned before the role of the courts, and that's really important to have judges, as we have, who understand the benefit of the treatment, so that even at the stage of the middle of a criminal proceeding, a judge, we hope eventually, can do some diversion.
Absolutely. The diversion program that we're rolling out is based on what's known as the sequential intercept model. And basically that says that when a person encounters the judicial system, the law enforcement system, there are predictable points at which there's a basis for diverting that person into treatment as opposed to having them proceed through the legal system. Initially, the scenario where you picked up the person at the convenience store, that's pre-arrest, basically. The next point is that the magistrate, The next point after that is in the courts, where the judge, the prosecutor, the public defender, and the CSB can collaborate to create conditions where the person can be diverted again into treatment as opposed to staying in the judicial system. And then at release is the fourth logical place. And then finally, when the person is out in the community using community supports, they can also be diverted at that point. And that would be to eliminate possibility or reduce the possibility of recidivism.
And Lieutenant Morgan, you know, since you're involved in heading up our training for police, and I think as people are listening, they're getting that picture that, boy, people have to have a lot of knowledge about conditions and everything from intellectual disabilities to mental health to substance abuse. And talk a little bit about the challenge for a police officer who has to make split-second decisions sometimes and to be trained and recognize that. What's that like for the officer on the street?
Well, there are those moments where it is really hectic, and you know, I don't want to give anybody a false notion that there aren't bad people out there. There are, and those people do need to go to jail. But there does come a point where situations are contained, and there's an opportunity for the officers to better dissect what exactly is happening, and that's where the officer can start to focus in on the person's mental state or other factors that are involved. We're very fortunate to live in a safe community, Fairfax County. We don't have a whole lot of those serious crimes that you mentioned. Most of the crimes are these low-level nuisance, misdemeanor type crimes. They're the vast majority of the calls that we respond to every day. And yeah, there is a place for some people in jail, but there is another place for folks who are suffering from mental illness, and we're just so thankful to be able to have this diversion program to be able to move those people from the jail system. And you know, our program is relatively new, but we're already showing that our stats are showing that about 41% of those folks that are coming in who have a potential crime associated with it are being diverted. So a substantial number of those police cases coming to Merrifield are being diverted. We're already seeing the numbers, and we're starting to factor those in.
You know, it's interesting. We talk about we're a big county, not only in population, but in geography. So, Laura, we have our mobile crisis units, and because we need to have these placement points around the county, right? We can't have every police officer have to drive all the way to Merrifield. So tell us about mobile crisis units.
Yeah, a lot of people, we learned this in a meeting recently, picture a TV show, a vehicle that's marked mobile crisis. The reality is we have a county vehicle. We have a couple of staff who go together as a team. They can respond to a police call where there's concern that there's a mental health situation that needs to be handled at the scene. We're involved in hostage barricade crises a lot. But basically, mobile crisis for the community, if someone is worried about a neighbor who's acting oddly, you can call mobile crisis and request that they do a check, which would just be an outreach for a potential crisis situation. We have one mobile crisis unit right now in Fairfax. We used some carryover funding to stand up a second mobile crisis unit. If you picture a county of 1.2 million residents and you picture one vehicle driving around answering calls, it's a low-resourced service, but an excellent service, and it's one that is, because not everybody is just going to come into the Merrifield Center to get checked out. Sometimes you have to outreach to the community. We find underserved populations very often who just aren't connected to us, and we find them and try to build those connections.
And the mobile crisis unit is staffed by 2 very senior clinicians. So we're in the process now of hiring the senior folks for the second mobile crisis unit.
And that's so critical because, you know, as Laura said, not everyone sort of comes in, but we need to get people out to the scene, out where the police officers are, instead of an officer or whatever. But when there's a situation out there, the idea is trying to get some folks out there who have the training to work with our law enforcement and otherwise, and then get into the programs that you're putting together.
Yeah, there are times where it's just, the officers don't know. I mean, as much training as we can get, we're just not the professionals in the mental health field. And sometimes we need that extra support and help, and mobile crisis is is like the premier vehicle that we have now to help officers out in the field when they're trying to make really tough, complex decisions.
And in a really great world, there's some models like in Bexar County, Texas, where they actually have teams of law enforcement and mental health professionals who really do that community outreach piece, which when you pair up the two, we certainly in mental health don't have the expertise that law enforcement has, just like you were saying, but when we come together, it's like a great marriage.
Right, and there's going to be a lot going forward of people working together, and we could talk about it for a long time, but we're out of time for today. Wow. So I want to thank Gary, Laura, and Lieutenant Morgan for joining me today, and for the hard work they're doing to put in place a system to provide treatment to low-risk individuals with mental illness instead of incarceration. If you need to call the CSB, they are available 24/7 at 703-573-5679. Of course, if it's an emergency, you should call 911. I hope you've enjoyed this segment of Braddock Neighborhood News. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or other needs, please contact my office at 703-425-9300 or email braddock@fairfaxcounty.gov. Tune in next month for another edition, and please remember to look for ways to volunteer. Your community needs you.